Hey, let's look at integrating Brandfolder, the digital asset management system, with Drupal. So here we have a Drupal demo site that we've set up using the Umami distro. This will look familiar to you if you've played with Drupal before. We've set up a couple contrib modules like entity browser, focal point, things like that. But we have all these food images that are managed using Drupal's standard media and file systems. If you were to look at one of these images, you would see it's sitting here locally on the server, site's default files path. We're using a particular image style. We've got that token. This is a JPEG file. It's been converted to a WebP. Again, that process is all happening locally on the server, and actual files are being transformed and saved in that local file system. Right. So now let's look at how we would go about introducing Brandfolder as a single source of truth for the image assets on the site, or as one source of truth to be intermixed with the other ways of managing media. So we're going to use this sample Brandfolder that we set up with a ton of additional images, some of the ones that we saw already on the site, and then we're going to hook this up. So real quick overview of how this Brandfolder is organized. We have all these images here with some basic approval and expiration workflows in process there. We have different collections, a few different labels, different sections. So the main images section is going to be the most relevant here. And we have all these other asset types though, to make this a little bit of a more realistic example. So the first thing we're going to do is going to go and grab the official Brandfolder module for Drupal, which is available here on Drupal.org. We're going to go ahead and pull that in and install that using Composer. Go ahead and get the latest and greatest version. That'll bring in all the necessary dependencies, most notably the Brandfolder PHP SDK, which helps facilitate a lot of the API interactions that we need. It'll also bring in the Drupal key module if that's not already part of your installation. We already have that as one of our project dependencies here, but we'll look at how that integrates in a moment. So let's go ahead and enable that module. Great, so far so good. So let's go ahead and log in as a Drupal admin. And now that we've enabled the Brandfolder module, you'll see under the config media section, this Brandfolder config option here. So the first main thing to do is to set up the credentials that the integration needs to connect to the Brandfolder API. So you're going to want to go ahead and grab the API keys from Brandfolder, and the module wants you to drop in 3 different types for users with 3 different roles in the org that you are connecting. So admin, collaborator, and guest, those are the 3 user types in Brandfolder. And we want you to put in one of each of these so that we can use the most appropriate key for any particular interaction. Just as an extra sort of security measure, if you really want to, you can drop in an admin key, use the same admin key for all 3 of these. It will currently work, but we recommend splitting that out because there are certain operations that would potentially need those different keys, not just for security and access scoping purposes, but also to actually achieve certain outcomes. So it's possible that in the future that would become more important. So just go ahead and do that now. If you're already familiar with the key module, then great. If not, what you do is you create keys that are stored a variety of supported ways, and then here you simply select a key that you've established. So I already set up 2 of these, but if I don't select all of these, it will yell at me, and I'm going to go ahead and quickly demo what that would look like to create a key using the key module. So I need to create one for a Brandfolder guest. So to get these keys, you would log into Brandfolder with the appropriate user, and then click on My Profile, and then here in the sidebar where it says integrations, just click on that, and then you'll see a list of all the organizations that you belong to, and you'll be able to copy an API key for each one. So just grab the key for the relevant organization, and then figure out how you want to store those keys on your Drupal site. You'll want to use this authentication option here, but then you can choose the most appropriate provider type. You could store it in Drupal config if you wanted to. You could set up a third-party service like Locker, or what we'll do here is pull it from an environment variable. So I already have an environment variable with that key, and then this will just want to know the name of that actual var in my system. And you can decide what makes sense for you in terms of your DevOps workflow for setting those, but here we'll just give it a friendly name. This doesn't matter. The point is that what's important is that you have a key stored in your system or in some third-party system, and then you tell Drupal how to reference it, basically. So there's no storage of sensitive data within the Brandfolder module configuration or anything like that. So now that I've done that, if I come back to the Brandfolder config page, I will see that new key. So once again, I'll just do 1, 2, 3 different key types. You'll see some other config options here. It's going to ask you which Brandfolder do you want to connect to, but it's not showing anything yet because we haven't saved those credentials. So let me go ahead and save that. Great. So it accepted those, and now it pulls in a list of Brandfolders that that admin user has access to. So we're going to go ahead and choose this one. Save that. And then if you wanted to, you could also choose a collection, a specific collection to look at. That only affects the preview here. So let's talk about that. We have a quick preview of relevant image assets here from the Brandfolder you selected. So this is helpful just to make sure the connection is working, and then you can also use it as a tool to kind of quickly experiment with some of these other settings. So this is displaying an image element with using the CDN URL, and then applying some of these other settings that we have. So let's look at those settings. Under metadata, you'll see it alludes to the fact that we can pull metadata from Brandfolder into Drupal and apply that to Drupal media entities. We'll look at that a little bit later. Alt text, though, is worth noting. We give special treatment to that, and what we recommend is setting up a custom field in Brandfolder for alt text. So if you look at our Brandfolder here, we created a custom field called alt text, and then for some of these assets, we've gone in and populated that. And you can automate that. You can figure out what makes sense, but we find that it's helpful for a lot of users to use a custom field for that, have at least a default alt text established in Brandfolder, and pull that into Drupal, and we can render that with all relevant image tags. So here it'll give you a list of any custom fields that you've defined in that Brandfolder. Choose the one that you're going to use for alt text. It doesn't have to be named alt text. That's what we've named it here, but do whatever makes sense for you. Then this next section is a pretty powerful set of options here. So you can use these settings to control how the image optimization settings on the Brandfolder CDN are applied. This works quite well for a lot of people to really cut down on bandwidth on the actual client data download sizes, to do things like delivering image is in a format that is catered to the particular client making the request. So we can say, kind of the simplest one is this one down here, to say serve it with whatever format is specified, except if we think the client is going to be able to process WebP images, which is most clients these days, then go ahead and serve a WebP image. If not, then fall back to whatever the otherwise specified format is. This one here is a little better still for most use cases. This will use an auto format option that includes a couple of other scenarios. And then what this controls here is to say, if we want to serve images with this auto format setting, do we want to do that even when something in Drupal is requesting a specific format? So you might see this if you have an image style applying an effect that says convert this image to a certain type. When we have that scenario, the Drupal Brandfolder module does respect that, and it will deliver the image in the requested format for compatible formats. But you probably won't need to do that unless it's a matter of having different image sources and having the same image styles for all, and for whatever reason you might need to do that. So this just lets you decide whether you want to force this auto format or only use it when another format is not explicitly specified, right? So you've got some options there. And the most important, the most dramatic effect you're going to see as far as these settings go is probably this quality setting. So for any lossy images, you can control the specific image quality. How much is it going to be compressed and optimized on a scale of 1 to 100? So you can often find something that will really reduce the file size without being noticeable to the naked eye. But to play with that, you can use these sample images here, and then obviously do testing on the actual rendered output of your site. But this is helpful to quickly do some experimentation and figure out a starting point. So let's go ahead and save those settings. So we defined the alt text field. We said use an auto format setting across the board for relevant images, and let's compress images to an 85% quality level. And you may not be able to notice any difference in that quality here. Go ahead and look at the actual data that's being transferred and see kind of where the best trade-off is for you. If we were to dial this way down to like 6% or something, we can do that just to show that it is making a difference. There you can see definitely a visible change, a lot more artifacting, blurry images here. But this is set up for you to go ahead to play with that, find something that works as a sensible default across the site, and then what you can do is you can take advantage of the fact that the module lets you alter the actual URL for any given Brandfolder image served by Drupal, and you can look at what is the context there, what is the image style if applicable, and then you could tweak the params controlling some of those quality settings on a case-by-case basis if you wanted. Like if it's a hero image, a high-value item, you might not dial the quality down quite as much, or if it's covered by an overlay or something, you can get away with really dropping that quality level, stuff like that. So you have a lot of power and possibility there. The other thing, these sample images will show you the alt text if it is able to pull that in, if you've defined that setting there. So if we look at these image tags, it shows you this is that alt text that came in from Brandfolder. Whereas this next one I don't think has one, so it has a default text for this page. So that's cool. And that pretty much rounds out the available settings that you can control through the UI. The one other one is you can enable detailed logging. So this will log all kinds of events to Drupal's logger, whether that's the database watchdog or log files or whatever. And that can be useful for initial setup testing. You probably don't want it on prod because it'll drop in a log event every time there's a Brandfolder API request, things like that. But it can be quite useful for dev or for short periods, for debugging, etc. So that's the initial setup. Now let's go ahead and look at next steps as far as actually implementing the integration with Brandfolder throughout the site. So the next thing you're going to want to do is go ahead and create some media types that are using Brandfolder as their source for imagery. So go ahead and hop over to the media types admin section. And here you'll see a lot of the standard media types that you'll probably be familiar with. But what we can now do, now that we've enabled the Brandfolder integration, we can add a media type, as many media types as we want, that have Brandfolder image as their source. And let's go ahead and create kind of a generic one at first. I'll just give a short-ish title that we can use to differentiate from the standard image media type. If you're using Brandfolder for everything, you might start out with a nice clean set of media types. You can call it image, you can call it whatever you want if you're not using some of those other types, but I'm just going to differentiate it here. Once you select Brandfolder image as the source, and currently images are the only major type supported, we will soon have support for documents, videos as well. But go ahead and choose Brandfolder image, and then these additional config options will come up. So what you can do is define exactly what parts of your Brandfolder are relevant for this media type, right? So for this one, what we're going to do is we're going to say this is, most of the images that we have in this Brandfolder are eligible for being used with this media type. But in Brandfolder, you'll remember we have these sections, labels, and collections defined. So let's go ahead and limit it to the images section, and that will cover most of the config that we need for this one, and then we'll look at something a little more specific later. But you can allow any number of these items, and then you can optionally disallow any of these items. So between these two sections, you can get a pretty good amount of control over what exactly is eligible, which assets are allowed to be used with this media type. And it's worth noting that when it comes to labels, labels can be hierarchical. So if I was interested in this campaigns label, by default, because we thought this was the best match for most use cases, what this will do is it'll say anything with the campaigns label is eligible, but also anything beneath that is also eligible. Because in Brandfolder, those labels are allowed to be nested, but if you select a parent label, it does not cascade that selection down to the descendants. Whereas in this integration, we treat these as inclusive of all their descendants. So you would say campaigns, which also would include all these three children, unless you went in and said, actually, no, I don't want one or all of these. But for now, let's just go ahead and say anything that's in that images section is eligible. And it's worth noting here, there are also some baseline criteria for assets to be considered for use in Drupal. They need to meet a few global qualifications. They need to be approved. They need to be published, not currently in draft mode, not waiting for a publication date that's in the future to come around, not expired, that sort of thing, which is a pretty globally applicable set of criteria. And you could override those as needed, but we find that that's a pretty universal standard. So for instance, this asset here should not be showing up for Drupal users. All right, so we're going to create our Brandfolder image media type. One other area you'll note here is there's all this metadata that is possible to pull in from Brandfolder and map it to Drupal media metadata, right? So these are kind of standard Drupal media metadata attributes here. When you first create one of these, the only one that's going to really be an option here is the name. So you can go ahead and map that to the Drupal name field or the name attribute. But the integration will also create, a possible mapping or a metadata source for any custom field in Brandfolder. A lot of these upload and modification dates, things like that. So you can do a lot here once you start mapping that data from Brandfolder. So custom fields and then some of that core image metadata. And we'll look at some of that a little bit more later. But let's go ahead and save that, and you can revision these or not. You can translate these. All right, so automatically it's going to create these two important fields. Those are locked down. Those are essential to how this whole integration operates. Each one of these media entities is going to be mapped one-to-one with a Brandfolder attachment. So in Brandfolder, everything we're looking at here is an asset. And then each one of those assets has one or more attachments, which basically correspond to individual files. Typically, everyone organizes their Brandfolder differently, but you might find it's useful to have attachments for different variations of the same photo, different shots in the same fundamental part of a photo shoot, different stylistic tweaks, whatever works for you. But when it comes to the Drupal integration, every time we create a new BF image media type, in this case, it's going to map directly to one Brandfolder attachment. And then on each one of these media items, there's going to be an image field, a Drupal image field, which is going to represent the image corresponding to that attachment. It's a fully fledged image field. It's going to be using a file that Drupal treats just like any other file, and we'll look more at that later. But let's go ahead and define how we want these to display. So I'm just going to set up a couple things here just for the purposes of demonstration. So image, this image field is the most important one right now. Let's go ahead and set up a custom display for this square view mode. Let's use a responsive image. So anything you can do with image fields in Drupal, you can do with these Brandfolder images. So there's a lot of power here. Let's go ahead and select the square responsive image style. So responsive image style, breakpoints, cropping, focal point, all that kind of stuff is totally fair game as far as the Brandfolder media items and the image fields that are associated with them. All right, so we've created our new media type. We've told it to display itself in a certain way. So when it's using the square view mode, it's going to display the Brandfolder image using this responsive image formatter, using this style. Now, how do we actually get entities of this type into Drupal, right? So there are two main ways currently supported to do that. There's via the media library or the entity browser module. You're going to use the custom Brandfolder asset browser to select an item from Brandfolder, and it'll automatically create one of these entity types for you. So let's go ahead and hook one of those up. If we look at our homepage here, here's that image we were looking at earlier. That's a local image. Let's go ahead and replace that with a Brandfolder image now. So in order to do so, first, let's update the entity reference field that this is using. Let's go ahead and look at what this is currently doing. So we have this content type called recipe. It has this field called media image. It's using the media library module. Here's the standard media library interface. So someone would have gone in here and selected this image media item. So let's go ahead and edit this field, and we can make Brandfolder one of the available options now. So for recipes, let's manage fields. Update that media image field. It allows one item per recipe. So here we now have the option of making this Brandfolder only, or we can allow multiple types. So the Brandfolder media type that we just created, that can just be one of many options. It depends on what your use case is, but let's go ahead and allow both for now. And then if we hop back to that node that we were editing earlier, now we have this sidebar here for selecting different media types, the standard image or now our Brandfolder image. So what this does is it swaps out that whole interface for a Brandfolder specific browser, and this will show eligible assets from Brandfolder based on whatever's eligible at this point in time when this modal was loaded here, and you can refine that list, text-based search, or any one of these filter options. Sorting, tags, upload date, file type, orientation can be useful. Labels here. One thing you don't see is a sections filter. That's because when we created this media type, we said the only things that are eligible are assets that live in the images section. So it's not useful to have a sections filter here. So only if there's more than one eligible possibility will the module create a set of filters. And this form is inheriting a lot of the admin theme styling. It takes up a lot of real estate. We'll be coming out with a new browsing experience, a new model for this asset browser soon. But the key thing to note here is that this is showing you whatever's available, whatever matches all the criteria for the given context, whenever the search is performed. So anything that's updated in Brandfolder, anything that's added to your Brandfolder will pretty much instantly show up for anyone who's searching for assets from within Drupal. These are all items that live in Brandfolder. They've not been pulled into Drupal. There's no Drupal representation of them at this point in time. But if and when we go ahead and select one of these, the Drupal module will create a new media entity on the fly for us. So let's talk about those criteria, though. We mentioned earlier there are some baseline criteria. Only approved assets will appear here. This first one, this would otherwise be the first item in the list, but it's still pending. That is not showing up here. We could go ahead and approve that. As soon as we perform a new search, that asset shows up in the search results. So it's pretty much instantaneous, live results. If something is scheduled for future publication, as soon as that publication date rolls around, people should start seeing it in their Drupal search results. So that's pretty cool. And the same thing conversely if you want to approve something or something expires. So it's showing approved, non-expired assets. It's only showing assets that are from that images section, which is what we defined on the media type. And then on top of that, the user can add their own criteria here. Once you select one of these assets, you then need to select a particular attachment. And again, the UI is a little funny here sometimes, but I'm going to select this attachment and say that's the one I want to use. Go ahead and insert that. So it's being processed, same exact outcome as before, except now we have that image coming from Brandfolder CDN. So totally different source, but Drupal's processing it exactly the same way. So that's one of the beautiful things about the integration. We are applying the same exact image style rules. Obviously there's work going on behind the scenes to make that possible. But you'll notice if you look at these URLs, you can see which image style is being used, just for your own peace of mind and that sort of thing. And then we are applying some of those transformations that we talked about earlier. So now we have a Brandfolder image happily coexisting alongside other local images. And you could use a mixture of all sorts of different sources for your media, or you could use Brandfolder for everything throughout your entire site. If we go ahead and look at the media that currently exists on the site, the media entities, you can see we now have a Brandfolder image, whereas before we only had standard images and so forth. we've got the entity usage module fired up here and showing data here about where that media item is being used. So all these other Drupal systems, are handling this Brandfolder media entity just like they would handle any other media entity in many respects, except for the key differences, obviously, in terms of how those are being served. So there's only one Brandfolder entity on the site right now because that's the only one that has been selected for use. So it's kind of case by case, as needed basis. These things will be created in Drupal, but it's not copying any files over to the Drupal file system, right? It's a legit file as far as Drupal is concerned. It's a managed file. It's associated with that image field on the media entity, right? But we don't accomplish that by copying files back and forth. There is no increased load on your Drupal server, your local file system, etc. It's all essentially virtual. And if we look at this files list, we have this file here, which again, as far as Drupal is concerned, is a perfectly legit file with all of its MIME type and size, and height and width data is associated with that field. We got the usage here; it's associated with that media item. This is the link to the actual file. If you look at the URI for this, it would start with like a BF file scheme instead of something that you might be familiar with, like a public file scheme and that sort of thing. So at a pretty deep level, these things are handled in a way that will be familiar to you and most importantly to Drupal itself, to Drupal core, as well as other contrib modules. So there's a lot you can do with these files and images and media entities. Now, if we go ahead and click on that media entity, there's not a lot here. The name is auto-generated. It's the name from Brandfolder, the name of the asset, and then the name of the attachment, which often are very similar if they're just auto-generated on the Brandfolder side based on single file upload. And you can change that as you like. The Brandfolder attachment ID is locked down, as we mentioned. You can see the usage in terms of where this media item is used, entity is used throughout the site. One thing we didn't do is we didn't specify how we want the edit form to look or what fields we want to appear here. Let's go back to the media type config and look at the form display settings. You can see there is also this Brandfolder image field, which was disabled. Let's pull that up just so we can see kind of a preview of that image. And then if we reload that edit page again, now we can see the image field and kind of a thumbnail, and you can see that this alt text came through from Brandfolder. So that's pretty cool. And again, this is kind of a internally managed field that's locked down. We don't want to be manually editing this. This is important to, kind of intrinsically important to the media entity for this particular Brandfolder attachment. But we do want to display this info here and add some additional functionality. This is kind of an edge case. Here's a workaround for orientation-based issues that can occur with certain combinations of hardware and certain sequences of ingesting assets into Brandfolder. And we can play with some of the widget options here a little bit later. But speaking of this alt text, let's just go back and double check that came through here. So we noted earlier that this is serving this image from Brandfolder now, and now you can see it's got the alt text right here, which is great. So anywhere throughout the site where we're rendering that should come through. We've got that width and height that we noticed earlier, and then of course we're rendering that whole field as a responsive image. So that's great. So let's talk about how we might want to configure things in terms of different media types for different contexts. So that's one of the other ways that we can take advantage of the options that the integration gives us. So say we wanted to have something a little bit more targeted in terms of saying, okay, we can use certain Brandfolder assets for certain media contexts on the site, right? So something like this giant hero image. There are a few different ways you can tackle this, but let's just create another media type that's limited to kind of pre-approved assets in Brandfolder that are kind of, from a creative perspective, from an art direction perspective, curated, vetted for these use cases. So we can go ahead and create another media type. We can create as many of these as we want with the same source, but with different config options, right? So we could say this is a Brandfolder hero image. Then we're going to say, okay, we have this label in Brandfolder. So anything that's approved for banner or hero use, we're going to slap this label on it. And then over in Drupal, we're going to use that to define what is eligible for use with this media type. You can see in Brandfolder, we have this label. banner hero images. So that narrows it down to 6 assets that we've applied this to so far. So anyone who goes into Drupal and tries to use one of these would see only these 6 instead of the other 70 or so, 50 or so assets. All right, so we've got these 2 fields. Let's set up some display settings, I think. So Brandfolder image, just like we did before, but now for these banners, let's see, we're gonna just go ahead and do this one for now. Let's do a responsive image. So the hero responsive image style. Now let's go ahead and see if we can populate one of those homepage banner block things with one of our new Brandfolder hero image media items. So they've got this home banner content block. Let's create something like that. If we were to edit that particular block, looks like we've got this media image field. Using the media library. So we can do a couple things here. So let's look at that block type. Banner block. Let's look at the display settings. This would be a good time to demo another option with the integration, which is to use the entity browser module. So here, instead of using the media library, we could use entity browser. First, we would have to create a Brandfolder enabled entity browser. If we go in here and select entity browser, we should see that there are not any available yet, right? So what we can do is hop over to the entity browser admin section, add a whole new entity browser. We can say and a modal. We're just going to have a single widget. The Brandfolder module provides a widget for us called Brandfolder Browser. It's not set up to work with the selection display options that this is referring to currently, so we're going to opt out of that here. And we'll get to the widget settings section, and you'll see Brandfolder Browser is an option here. Let's go ahead and add one of those. There it is. So here it'll let you choose a media type. You need to choose one Brandfolder linked media type, so we know where to store the entities that we create from this context. We're going to go ahead and choose the one that we just created. I should give it a better name. There we go. So now if we were to go back to that block field, and go entity browser, now we have one to choose from, and it's the only one. Let's say, if we've already chosen an entity, let's show the rendered entity with something smallish. This edit option will be useful. Remove and replace. We'll just leave those as is, as they are. Here we go. So now if I want to create a new block, let's see if we can create our own homepage banner hero block here. Add a new block, banner block. choose some random destination here just to populate these guys. And then media image. So this should now be using Entity Browser, the one that we just created. It's using the Brandfolder browser widget. So now this is going to spin up a Brandfolder browser, the same exact inner workings as we saw with the Drupal media library context a minute ago. But now this obviously looks different because it's the media type that we're working with. We configured it to only allow assets from that one label. So it's the same 6 assets that you see here. That's what we have to work with. And this is a small sample case, but it's a great illustration of how we have that different media type working with a different Brandfolder subset, basically. Let's go ahead and choose this pineapple one here. One selection is allowed, one item is allowed here. We've reached our limit. There's our image preview. Let's save that. Let's tell it where to display. The media cannot be referenced. Oh, this is the standard Drupal validation message when the media doesn't match the rules defined for that field. Yeah, because we never changed. We just took this field that was set up to work with normal media, image media, and we didn't change it to allow Brandfolder media. All right, let's take a look at that. So we were looking at block types, banner blocks. So we never came in here and changed the field. See how it says media type image. The allowed media type list only consists of the standard image media. So let's add ours to the list. So that's now going to be valid. We'll keep this here for now. We'll let the old ones live happily. Let's see if we can save that now. Great. All right, so there's our new block. Configure the display. Don't show the title. Show it on the home page. In that banner top region. There it is. Let's replace that other one. It's a little cumbersome here, but with the Omami demo here, we just have these one-off blocks dropped in. Doesn't really matter. We're just gonna remove the one that was there previously. Now we should see our new content block sitting there on the home page. Save it just for good measure. Hit the home page again. And there we go. There it is. Not really getting the pineapple message across though. So this wide crop isn't really doing us a lot of favors here. It's almost like Artichoke Express, for all we know here. So this is a great illustration of where some custom cropping would really come in handy. So you may already be super familiar with this, but let's look at how we can do that and show how we can get that set up with these Brandfolder images. So we mentioned earlier, a lot of those same image systems are fully supported by the integration. So let's take advantage of that. So we're rendering this with that responsive image style that we set up. I believe we have the focal point module set up on some of these underlying individual image styles. Like this, you can see we have scale and crop with these dimensions that is using the focal point module. So what that means is if we set up our block widget to use one of the focal point widgets, we can control where the emphasis is when we have to make a crop that removes a portion of the image. So we go to manage form display for our block type, media image, entity browser. So it's like, wait, we need the entity browser, right? So what we're actually interested in is not this entity reference field, but it's the image field on the media type. So let's go into the new hero, BF hero image media type. And we looked at that image field earlier that was pointing to that Brandfolder image. And now this is where that really comes into play here. So we've got Brandfolder image. Now we want this image focal point widget. Then let's give that a little bit of a bigger preview image so we can really set that focal point with a little bit more precision. There we go. So now when we edit that block, or I should say when we edit the media item, we should be able to set that focal point. So we could get there a couple different ways, but first let me look here at the block. And earlier we enabled this little edit button, so this is useful now. Clicking this will edit the underlying media entity. And because of what we just configured, we can now control this focal point. So we want to bring this down. So let's prioritize the pineapples, right? So any crop should try to include this focal point and bring it all the way down there. Could use that preview there. I don't think that image style is in that list right now, but that can be quite useful to set that up with your top image styles to preview the impact of that focal point selection. So we save that, and then look at that. So this is a great illustration of how we're using a responsive image style, which is applying different roles and different breakpoints here. So this one is actually using a different image style than the one that we had the focal point on. This one is using the focal point scale and crop, so it's now respecting the custom focal point that we just set up. If we want, we can just double check that. So we put the image style in the URL kind of for convenience or for times just like this, so you can have clarity around what is driving that particular transformation of the image. So 7.3 wide. There it is. Scale crop 7.3 wide. So that one didn't have the focal point set up. Let's go ahead and add it. Focal point scale and crop. 3000 by 1285. So crop it to those dimensions, scale down as applicable, crop off, vertically or horizontally as needed to make it fit. We're not going to distort the image. And then when we choose which part of the image to crop, if we need to crop something, we're going to prioritize the focal point. That's the key difference here. So all these image effects are going to be applied by the Brandfolder custom image toolkit. So any image field, any file that's being processed throughout the site that is handled by that Brandfolder stream wrapper, it's going to be using a custom image toolkit that knows how to apply image effects to Brandfolder files, and it's going to transform them as well as it can. So scaling, cropping, including these custom crop regions, those are fully supported. If you try to do something else like the different filters that you might use with like image magic and that kind of thing, those aren't going to have any effect currently. But as far as the core use cases of scaling and cropping, those should all be fully supported. Conversions will also, as mentioned earlier, those will also work. They really shouldn't be necessary, but it shouldn't break anything, and it should deliver the corresponding type from Brandfolder if it's one of the supported types, unless you've chosen to override that like we looked at earlier. So now we've got our new focal point scale and crop. We're going to replace the original. Run that first. So there's that. So now at this particular breakpoint, I think that's the one that we were seeing in use, and indeed it was. So there we go. Kind of a lot of clicking around just to see this one change, but it's the same exact process that you would be doing for any other Drupal site. You just might have different ways of approaching it. And here we're modifying something that already existed. But it's a good chance to show that those image effects are supported, and you have fine-grained control over how you're handling these responsive images. You can mix and match entirely different, aspect ratios and things like that for different breakpoints, and we can look at that here, and that should all be respected. So there we go, focal point. We edit the Brandfolder Drupal media entity with its image field, and we set that focal point, and now we can see our pineapples. So that's awesome. You saw that it was pulling in that alt text. What else? So we mentioned alt text is pulling from a custom field, but we also have a couple other custom fields that we set up here in Brandfolder. And some of these have captions or image credits. So image credits is a great common use case, right? You want to have, for copyright purposes, your rights owner is credited, and that's usually applicable to anywhere this asset would be used. So it's a great digital asset management case study in terms of having that single place to define that. And you can, again, sort of set that as part of your asset submission or approval workflow. You can automate that. You can pull it from other sources. You can pull it from EXIF data or whatever, etc. But what we can do with the Drupal integration is store that in a custom field and then use that mapping that we talked about earlier to pull that into a Drupal media field, media entity field. So a lot of these have that custom field defined. So let's look at a couple other scenarios here. So for this hero image media type, let's go back and edit that and say, hey, we want to pull that image credit data in to the entity and store that somewhere. Well, the Brandfolder module has already said, hey, I'm ready to provide that data, but we don't have a field to store it in. So what we want to do is create a field for it on the Drupal side. Just a plain text field. All right, so there we have our field. So by default, it's going to display a label, plain text. You might have a formatter that would make sense to use for this. You may already have this on your site if you're incorporating this into an existing site. You may already have this sort of field in use, and you can just map the Brandfolder data to it, and great. If not, you can figure out how you want to display that. So for now, it's going to show an image credit prefix with whatever that text field value is, if it's there. So now we should be able to map it. So the field exists. Let's go back to that media type config page. You notice this field here, we didn't really actually need to set that earlier, but if you had other image fields or something, you could do different things there. But we're interested now in this one here. Let me refresh this page. There's our new field. So image credit, the Brandfolder custom field called image credit, we want that to get mapped to our Drupal field called image credit. So now it'll start pulling that data in. So it's not going to do it retroactively right now for those media entities that were already created. But we do actually have a webhook listener which would listen to updates on the Brandfolder side and then pull that metadata in. And what it will do is, in that case, as well as for newly created Drupal media items, if whenever there's not already data sitting in the Drupal field, it will pull in the Brandfolder data if it's available, right? So if you set up webhooks on your Brandfolder for asset update events, then the Drupal module has an endpoint that you can point that to, and it will handle. It'll respond to that by fetching all the data it needs to from Brandfolder. It'll ping back, get that data, and then map it to any existing. See if there are any Drupal entities that correspond to that asset, to any of that asset's attachments. It'll run through those. It'll update these metadata field mappings. It'll update the alt text with that custom field data that we talked about before. So that's very useful to kind of keep things in sync. Then once it does have data in one of these fields, if you can override it in Drupal, and then that will not go back up to Brandfolder. It's a one time, until it gets populated. Then it's sort of in Drupal's court, so to speak. We don't send data back from Drupal to Brandfolder. And if you change something on the Drupal side or not, you can change it or not, but whatever you set in Drupal is going to be unchanged by future Brandfolder updates at that point. So let's see if this will come in for a new media item. So here's another asset over in Brandfolder that has that image credit defined. So let's try pulling that in. Let's do another one of those homepage blocks. do you spell out a T? Something like that. All right, media image, entity browser. These are all our eligible assets. Let's grab this macarons item. Take that first one. Select. It had never been used in Drupal before, so it's automatically creating a new media entity in the background and associating it with this block now, via this field. There's that image credit, so that's the Drupal field, and it's by default being displayed, which is great for illustrating it. Obviously, you can tweak with all those settings as needed. Let's go ahead and set that up. No title, front page, banner top. There it is. Let's kill the one we set up a minute ago. Hit the home page again. There we go. So there's our new hero with this nice macaron image. And how can we get that image credit data to show up here? So we are rendering this as it's kind of like it's just sort of showing the image in the background, and then it's got this flex container. Image credit is sitting in here. It's it's behind the image. So here's some CSS I threw together to see if we can demonstrate styling that. Just kind of throw that in the bottom corner of the image, bottom right corner of the image. Clear my caches so that that theme library will be refreshed here. And there it is. Cool. So the data stored in Brandfolder, we pulled it into Drupal, we populated a custom field, and then we can display that field however we want. We set up a pretty basic display just now, but you can pass it through whatever views or templating, layout builder, theme, templates, components, whatever to your heart's content. I mean, the point is that the data's there in Drupal. You can use it as you like. Now, let's say we wanted to tweak this block. Said, this whole black space is kind of not really what we're going for. Let's pull in another variant of that image, right? I'm going to go ahead and remove that particular Brandfolder media entity. Add a different one. Same asset, but we have these two variants here. Let's go ahead and select the one that's mirrored. So it's a totally new entity in Drupal. We have two different media entities now because it's a one-to-one. For every Brandfolder attachment, there's a different unique Brandfolder media entity for each media type. But it has that same image credit field populated because we set up that mapping logic and it's pulling it from the same asset in Brandfolder. All those custom fields are defined at the asset level in Brandfolder. So you update the block, different Brandfolder attachment, different image variant essentially, and there we go. So it's like, hey, that works a lot better with our layout. We still have the image credit. That's great, and we're good to go. Now let's say we looked a minute ago at the focal point. We looked at the image styles. We looked at the responsive image styles. Great example of how to use something like that would be if we have this. Let's preview this in like a mobile sort of a screen with so let's say we wanted to have a different image treatment when we get down to a mobile device here. Let's take advantage of that responsive image style and use a totally different aspect ratio to do something like a taller portrait crop for that image. Actually, here, let's do this. Images. This is the one that it actually loaded for that width, and it's using the scale crop 7:3 tiny image style. Okay, so let's hop back over whoever logged in as an admin here and say, okay, media, responsive image styles. All right, so this is what we're interested in here. And we saw earlier it was using that 7:3 tiny. So here we have all those different breakpoint to image style mappings. Medium. So here's the one that was applying to that screen width we were looking at earlier. So let's say instead of using this image style at this breakpoint, let's use this one. So we'll go more vertical, 2:3 aspect ratio. Everything else will stay the same, so all the other breakpoints will still serve that wide aspect ratio image. But we want to see what it would look like at this breakpoint. Cool, so there it is. And then, let's tweak these styles just for demo here. Put this together a minute ago to say, hey, let's change the layout at that breakpoint. Clear the caches and see if we can get that new style showing up here. Sweet. So there we go. At this particular width, we're using a whole different aspect ratio, different image style, and that you can see. Whereas before it was serving this from Brandfolder, now it's serving this. And so you can you can do whatever you want with this. It's obviously in combination of all these different Drupal systems and settings. You can, mix and match those, especially, with your theme, do pretty much whatever you want here. And the beauty of this is that Drupal is aware of how you want to manage these layouts. You're in control of what image style you want to apply at these different breakpoints. Before we ever request anything from the Brandfolder CDN, we know kind of what we need and what would be overkill as well. Even what we just saw right now might be more than we need in terms of the actual image width for some breakpoints. But so you have control over that is the point. You can optimize that, and then you never need to request a giant image. It's not that we're requesting the same image and then just kind of modifying that on the front end. We're requesting only what we need, and then we can further optimize that. For each breakpoint, we're getting an optimized image based on those global settings that we looked at back at the beginning in terms of some of those formatting as WebP, auto, the quality. You can see this is fairly downsampled here. And we can reduce that even further probably because we have this overlay. So it's like, hey, I could do a quality 30% instead of 80%, and it would still probably look fine. And this could be like 10 kilobytes instead of 30 or whatever the case may be, so on and so forth. So that's a great illustration of how this plays really nicely with Drupal's responsive image styles and custom cropping. This actually looks quite good here in some ways in terms of the focal point, but we could shift that over if we wanted to see more of these macarons. We could change that focal point and we'd be in business. Image credit, custom field mapping. So it's a good illustration of all of those things. So that's a rundown of kind of the core set of features that the module provides. There are a couple other things. We mentioned earlier there are some alter hooks that you can use if you're writing your own modules, and you can customize some of the behavior further. You can extend and riff off of this as needed. We looked a little bit at the image browser, and that's one area where we're going to be adding new features soon. That's a priority area to kind of improve the UX, take better advantage of screen real estate, cut down on some unnecessary back and forth between the back end and front end, and then optimize some of the API calls, cache some data, improve the response time, stuff like that. So keep an eye out for those updates. But if there's anything that you run into issue-wise, just hop onto Drupal.org, add an issue to the issue queue, and let us know what's a priority for you, and get in touch. All right, happy integration.